Well, good evening. This is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Nice to be back with y'all. I want to talk to you tonight about the trip that Pope Benedict made to Cuba, and specifically the things that he said during that visit. Uh, his remarks were especially timely, I think, being that this is almost Palm Sunday tomorrow. It's a week before Easter, because you see the situation in Cuba, and specifically what the Pope said, really reflects the hypocrisy of both people on the left and on the right. Now, I thought maybe I'd start out by talking a little bit about where libertarians stand on Cuba. The Pope talked in terms of condemning this horrible embargo that's been going on for more than 50 years now. Now, granted, he also condemned Marxism and implicitly socialism. I mean, everybody acknowledges that that's one of the twin roots of Cuban poverty. When the state centrally plans everything, when it takes everything over, healthcare, education, people's resources, when it becomes the sole employer, the prosperity just caves in on itself. But the Pope did something more than that. He criticized the U.S. government, and I think implicitly the American people, because Americans by and large have gone along with this thing. And he said that, look, that as bad as people are suffering there, it's absolutely wrong. He condemned the adding to that suffering. And that's what the U.S. government has done for more than 50 years. The Cuban people have essentially been caught in a vice. On one side of the vice that's squeezing them is their socialist system. But the other side of the vice, and this is the immoral, despicable shame that we, the Americans, have to live with, that the U.S. government has to live with, is that we have provided, this government has provided, this country has provided the other side of the vice. And that's this cruel and brutal, vengeful, personal, vindictive embargo that has helped to squeeze the lifeblood out of the Cuban people. And, several years ago, I visited Cuba, and I can tell you that those people are on the verge, always on the verge of starvation. I mean, it's just life is day to day because of the horrible, horrible poverty. But, it's interesting that they were among the nicest people I have ever met in my life. I'm just generalizing, of course, but everywhere I went, Cuban people just had this genuineness about this niceness about them, nothing fake or false. They were just nice people, and they knew I was an American. And I asked a cab driver once, I said, how come everybody's so nice to me when they know what my government has done to them with this embargo? And the Cuban cab driver said, what responsibility do you have for what your government does? That's a fascinating question. Does a citizen have responsibility for what his government does? Certainly, in the eyes of God, does he have responsibility? Does he have moral responsibility? And, I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, but I'm not taking any chances. That the way I figure it is that when your government is engaged in wrongdoing, horrific wrongdoing, which it is and has been with respect to Cuba, that the best thing to do is to disassociate yourself from that. That is, that when the laws of God collide with the laws of man, when man actually pretends to know better than God, or pretends that his laws should trump God's laws, that's when it's time, in my opinion, for the Christian to disassociate himself, to say, I'm standing against man's laws, I'm going to pursue God's laws. Well, unfortunately, that's not what most American Christians have done, at least not for the last half century. Most people have had this mindset of malleability, deference to authority, go along with whatever the state says, especially the national security state. and especially during the Cold War, and then now later in the war on terrorism, that whatever the national security says, whatever the military says, the CIA, the NSA, the president, the Congress, or whatever, that we should defer to that. That we shouldn't think in terms of God's laws. We shouldn't think in terms of our individual consciences. That our minds should just meld themselves to be consistent with whatever the authorities decree. I don't see things like that. I mean, I think that you got to respond to your own individual conscience. And one doesn't, I don't know whether God's going to hold people responsible for the acts of government that they support. But I figure, why take a chance? You know, when the government's engaged in wrongdoing, when it's violating God's laws, then that's the time for the Christian to stand aside, to oppose it, and maybe even stand in front of it and say, no, Lord, I need to show you that I have absolutely nothing to do with this. And this embargo is a classic example of this. And you can see it. I mean, now, Easter time, when we're talking about, the risen Christ and so forth, it's a perfect time because we all know that Christ had to deal with hypocrites, right? I mean, that was one of the things that, bedeviled him as he walked on this good earth, was the hypocrites. And we can see the hypocrites, we can see that hypocritical mindset in both liberals and conservatives with respect to the people of Cuba. Liberals, what do they say? They say, oh, we love the poor and the needy and the disadvantaged. This is why we favor the welfare state. Oh my gosh, we favor Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and welfare, farm subsidies, aid to dictators and all the other foreign aid, because we love the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. Oh? Well, then why have you maintained this cruel and brutal embargo for more than 50 years? You did it under Kennedy, who started it. He's a liberal. You did it under Johnson, the liberal par excellence. You did it under Carter and Clinton. You've done it under democratically controlled Congresses. You've maintained this thing, this cruel and brutal machinery, for more than 50 years, knowing what it was doing to the poor people of Cuba. And you dare to tell us how much you love the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged? Your hypocrisy it reeks. It just absolutely reeks. Your love of the welfare state has nothing to do with the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. Look what you people have done to immigrants. If you love the poor and the needy and the disadvantaged so much, why do you incarcerate people and punish people, and deport people and separate their families? Simply because they want to work, because they want to get a job. But, and it's the same thing with your treatment of the Cuban people. How can you live with yourselves when you're out there professing that you love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged, and use that as the justification for all your little socialist programs, and then you have this brutal embargo that helps to squeeze the lifeblood out of the Cuban people? And let me tell you something. The Republicans in this hypocrisy game, they're not any better. They're exactly the same way, but in a different way. Now, what do the Republicans and conservatives say? Well, they've got their little mantras, and you can see Mitt Romney, for example, doing it right now. He's talking about economic freedom. He's obviously grabbed it from Ron Paul, and he's thinking, oh, well, I'll just grab it. Nobody will notice. And he says, I'm a big proponent of economic freedom. And you see conservatives always talking about, what's their favorite mantra? Free enterprise, private property, and limited government. Go to the Heritage Foundation website. They're the premier conservative foundation in the country. Go to any conservative website, and you will see that little mantra. Free enterprise, private property, limited government. Listen to their speeches. Hardly a conservative speech is ever made without the little mantra. It's almost like an obligatory thing, or at their conferences, they'll have it on their little banners. Look at their websites, free enterprise, private property, limited government. But then at the same time, Romney and all that ilk, all the conservative ilk, or most of the conservative ilk, favors and has maintained this brutal economic embargo against the Cuban people. Now, how does that how is that embargo reconciled with economic freedom? Well, here's how the embargo works. They put you and me in jail if we dare to travel to Cuba and spend our money there. You see, contrary to popular misconception, the federal authorities here in this country have not made it a federal crime to travel to Cuba. Okay? You know why they didn't do that? Because they were scared. They were scared of being accused of being against fundamental rights. Because everybody's always held that freedom of travel is a fundamental right. It's a God-given right. You got a right to travel wherever you want. And so they were concerned. Now, obviously, federal officials don't believe in that as inherent to mankind. These fundamental rights that Jefferson talked about that are inherent to mankind. They see rights more like privileges that the government gives people. So they see, the freedom to travel is a privilege that government gives. But they don't want to be put in that position of having to say, well, we're infringing on the right of travel, the privilege of travel that is granted to our own citizens, because they were afraid that they would look bad. Because like traditionally, a free society involves the right of citizens to travel freely, unimpeded by their own government. So they did something very clever. They said, look, we're not going to bar you from traveling to Cuba. We're going to bar you from spending money in Cuba. Okay. Now, it's not that simple even, because like most crimes are like just bad in and of themselves. I mean, many crimes are bad in and of themselves, like murder. That's just a bad crime. There's no way to say, well, we can give you permission to murder if it's necessary, or rob or steal. They're just malamin se. They're bad in and of themselves. Well, that doesn't apply to spending your own money, obviously, right? I mean, there's instances where you get to spend your own money and it's not a crime. So what they've done here is they said, it's going to be a federal crime if you spend money in Cuba unless we give you permission. You see, if the federal authorities through the Treasury Department give you a license to spend your own money in Cuba, then they won't prosecute you. They won't try to put you in jail. But if you go to Cuba and you spend money there without your license from the state, they will do everything they can to prosecute you. They will have you indicted by a federal grand jury. They will do their best to talk the judge into sending you to a long prison term, because you have violated their rules and regulations on what you can do with your own money. Now, what is economic freedom if it's not the right, the fundamental God-given inherent right that Jefferson talked about in the Declaration of Independence, to go anywhere you want in the world and spend your money any way you want? I mean, it's your money, isn't it? Isn't that what private property is all about? If you want to engage in an economic transaction with somebody in another country, why should your government have the authority to interfere with that? You see, how is that reconciled, Mr. Conservative, under principles of free enterprise and private property and limited government? It's not. And, oh, Mr. Romney, by the way, economic freedom involves the right to do whatever you want with your own money. To travel to Cuba and spend money there, donate it to the poor, do whatever you want. And it certainly doesn't involve asking your government for permission to do what you want with your own money. In fact, the irony of this thing is that when they imposed this system, this regime here in the United States on the American people, the mindset was no different from the Castro mindset. I mean, Castro's economic mindset was, I'm going to nationalize everything. I'm going to provide, free housing and free health care and free education, and I'm going to centrally manage the economy, and I'm going to direct what's going to happen here economically. Well, how is that different from a mindset that says we're going to control what Americans do with their own money? We're going to put them in jail if they spend their money in the wrong way. We're going to maintain direction, central planning on what Americans do with their own money. Oh, and by the way, Aren't we headed toward government-provided health care for everyone? I mean, we already have Medicare and Medicaid. How's that different from what Castro was doing? Uh, Free public education. That's one of his pride and joys. And of course, what do we have here? But you see, in the mindset of the liberal and the conservative here in the United States, these socialistic programs are freedom and free enterprise. In Cuba, they're socialism. I mean, that's the life of the lie that has been portrayed, for at least the last 50 years under the regime of the national security state. Now, how do they justify this embargo, this cruel, brutal system where they hurt the Cuban people and they infringe on the freedom of the American people. They infringe on our freedom. They have essentially a fascist type system to hurt people in Cuba. Well, what they say is that by prohibiting Americans from spending money there, they're going to hurt the Castro regime. In other words, what they're trying to do is get rid. This is what they've done from the beginning, from the time Castro took power, 1959. The national security state here in the United States, the CIA and the military, they have been totally and absolutely committed to regime change. You know, the same kind of regime change we saw in Iraq 10 years ago, we saw in Afghanistan. Before that, we saw it in other places, Guatemala. We saw a regime change in Iran in 1953. We saw a regime change in Chile, 1973. I mean, we've seen any number of instances of regime change. Well, this is one where they were trying to oust Castro from power in order to replace him with a pro-U.S. dictator, the same kind of dictator that had ruled before Castro. That was a guy named Batista, Fulgencio Batista. He was a pro-U.S. dictator, and the U.S. loved him because he maintained order and stability, and he would do what the U.S. wanted him to do. He would join a coalition of the willing, or he would do this or do that. And by the same token, just like when they put the Shah of Iran into power, the CIA did, that Batista could do whatever he wanted to the Cuban people. He was a brutal dictator. And finally, the Cuban people revolted, led by Fidel Castro, and Castro ousted him from power. But there were two problems with Castro. One is he wouldn't kowtow to the empire. I mean, that just infuriated them. They wanted him to take orders. This was Cuba. I mean, they've had, the history of control over Cuban affairs since 1898. When they told the Cubans and the Filipinos and stuff that they were coming to their defense against the Spanish Empire, and they were going to help them gain their freedom and their independence. It was the first lie of the movement toward an empire and the abandonment of a constitutionally limited republic in our land. As soon as Spain was defeated, the U.S. took control over Cuba, maintained that control all the way up to Batista. Same thing with the Philippines. I mean, they killed, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people there who were struggling for independence, first against Spain and then against the U.S. government that said, no, you can't get independent after all. We must maintain dominion and control over you. And that was how the U.S. empire got started. And so all of a sudden, Castro comes into power and says, nope, that's the end of it. Cuba's going to be sovereign and independent and free of U.S. government control. And man, at that moment, he was on the outs. I mean, as far as the CIA was concerned and the national security state, the military, I mean, they became obsessed with, along with the president, Eisenhower, Kennedy, all the rest of it. They've been completely obsessed with how do we get rid of this man. And part of it was assassination attempts. I mean, they were actually trying to murder the guy. They might still be trying to murder him for all I know. They had terrorist attacks within Cuba. I mean, imagine our government engaged in terrorism within Cuba because they happen to have a communist leader. And you see, that was the other justification, is that Fidel Castro's a communist, and therefore we have the authority in the U.S. government to assassinate him. And we have the authority to squeeze his citizenry so that they get angry They get desperate. They start starving to death. They have a violent revolution in which they oust him from power and put in a pro-U.S. dictator. Or the military has a coup, like in Chile in 73, 13 years later, where they oust the communist, socialist, democratically elected president and install a pro-U.S. military dictatorship. And the whole idea was because this guy, one, wouldn't become a member of the empire. If he had, it would have been no problem. I mean, Castro would still be in power. Everybody'd be friends and all. All they wanted was him to kneel and say, "You will do as you're told." It's sort of like the Godfather, That was the attitude of the U.S. government. That, we'll leave you alone. You can do whatever you want in your country. But when we need a favor, like a vote at the United Nations or a member of the coalition of the willing when we invade a country and effect regime change, you will be there to support us. Castro said no, that for the first time in history, the Cubans are going to be free and independent. And of course, there was no freedom in that sense. I mean, he imposed a socialist system. He's got horrible violations of religious liberty and civil liberties, which is what the Pope pointed out. But on top of this, the U.S. government uses the Cuban people as the pawn, is to say, we will squeeze you to deprive him of tax revenue. You see, that was their whole idea, that if Americans go down there and spend money, that money, some of it's going to make its way up to the government, because that government, like this government, taxes people. And so the U.S. government said, we will prohibit Americans. We will take freedom away from Americans to travel and trade and donate and spend their money the way they want, in order to squeeze the Cuban people, make them starve to death, make them suffer, so that they get angry and oust their ruler from power. Well, year after year, this thing just went on and on and on, decade after decade, and it was obvious that the regime change wasn't working. And of course they were saying, oh, but he's a communist and this is a Cold War. But let's keep something in mind here, because this whole Cuba experience is really reflective of what the national security state has done to our country. I'm talking about the U.S. national security state, not the Cuban national security state. The Cuban national security state, because they have the same sort of system there. Notice a few things here. They never invaded the United States. They never attacked the United States. They never went to Miami Harbor with military forces. They never entered into a partnership with the mafia to assassinate any American officials. They just stayed there defending themselves against what the CIA and the military was conjuring up here in the United States. I mean, and this is what's so incredible, is that we've all grown up with this, and it's been inculcated in our minds that the U.S. government was doing good, that it was doing good by assassinating a communist, that it was doing good by squeezing the citizens, the lifeblood out of the citizenry of a communist regime. Oh, and where's the moral authority for that? That because people happen to be suffering under a communist regime, where's the moral authority for the U.S. government to go and squeeze the life up out of them? Where's the moral authority to assassinate someone because he happens to share a different economic philosophy, and really not that different, given that Castro believes in the same socialist philosophy that both American liberals and conservatives believe in? Health care for the poor, Medicare and Medicaid. Show me a conservative that doesn't believe in Medicare and Medicaid. Oh yeah, they'll object to Obamacare, but the root of the deal, Medicare and Medicaid, helping the poor and the needy and the elderly, I'm not going to complain about that. Social Security, show me one liberal and conservative that objects to that program. None of them do. Okay? Well, okay, maybe one or two. But by and large, they're not going to get up there and say repeal Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid today any more than Castro is. He's got Social Security there too. Public schooling, oh yeah, they can say abolish the Department of Education. But very few conservatives will ever say have a total free market in education. So that, like libertarians do. Now, so there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of that socialist mindset that Castro had and the average liberal and conservative here. But I ask you again, where's the moral authority to assassinate somebody because you disagree with his economic philosophy? And of course, it didn't stop there. The national security state went after people here. They did their best to destroy people that were part of the American Communist Party. There were different organizations that were pro-socialist, that were pro-Cuba, that were, that. Well, let me tell you how a free society handles people like this. Remember, I'm a libertarian. A free society just leaves people alone. People are free to join any kind of organization they want. They want to join the Communist Party. They want to join the Marxist Society. They want to join the Capitalist Society. They want to join whatever kind of society. That's what a free society is all about. And yet the FBI and the CIA was monitoring people, keeping tracks of them, secret files. This is exactly what was happening in Nazi Germany. It's exactly what was happening in communist Russia. The KGB, the Gestapo, yes, keeping files on people, monitoring people, people that were dangerous to the state. Well, that's how they viewed the Communist Party and the Marxists and the Socialists. They had this huge paranoia of, oh my gosh, they're going to take us down. Oh my gosh. It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And they were adopting the methods. Oh, by the way, Castro does the same thing. He maintains files on everybody, keeps track of everybody. He's got neighborhood spies that's their job. They're neighborhood watch people for the government. They keep track on there. They report unusual things. Well, so here we are more than 50 years after this craziness. The Cold War is over. They don't even have the communist threat anymore to justify their embargo. They got trade with Vietnam, where they sacrificed 58,000 American men with, especially with that lie about the Gulf of Tonkin attack. Trade with China. I mean, we mutually coexist with these communist regimes. As a libertarian, I think communism is the most abhorrent thing in the world. But I also would defend the right of people to advocate it, to promote it. I mean, that's what freedom is all about. You battle ideas with other ideas. You don't go and start monitoring and keeping files and destroy people and try to spread look into their private lives and disclose some of their faults and failures. And that's not what a free society is all about. And the irony is that the Cold War is over. It's been over, 15 years or so. And Castro's still there in power. Now his brother's in power. But they still have this embargo. Why? I mean, there's never been any threat by the Cuban regime to send terrorists over here. They describe it as a terrorist state, but really it's the U.S. government that engaged in terrorism and sabotage against the Cuban regime and against the Cuban people. The embargo. I mean, what better example than state terrorism than that? I mean, that's the government doing this thing, putting Americans in jail for wanting to transact, trade, and maybe help the Cuban people. It can't be justified in the war on terrorism. Well, what is it then? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's just personal. It's vengeful. It's vindictive. That's all it is. That they're mad about the Bay of Pigs. They're mad that Fidel Castro didn't surrender. They're mad that he didn't just leave the country. They're still angry. They can't get over it. And they're still obsessed with this control and domination of Cuba that for some weird, bizarre reason, it stretches all the way back to 1898. It's passed from generation to generation, statist after statist. And now it still affects the mindsets of the CIA. It's still the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, they're really just all hoping that Castro can die so they can say, oh, gosh, our embargo finally worked. Well, it shouldn't come to that. It's up to the American people to put a stop to this. It's time for Americans to look inward, to conscience, and to look at God's laws. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And to start questioning and challenging these syndromes, these pathological syndromes that we've grown up with, the authority to assassinate people because you don't like their beliefs, the authority to squeeze the lifeblood out of a citizenry as a way to get rid of their ruler and install your dictator into power. These are the kind of things that we Christians, that we Americans, that everybody in this country needs to start challenging and examining. We need to stand against our government, to speak out against it, to stand against it when its laws violate the laws of our God and the laws of nature. And that's exactly what this embargo does. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week. And thanks so much. Have a nice rest of the weekend. And happy Easter to you too. Bye-bye.